Murphy's Garage. Thanks for joining me. This is my first YouTube video, so here's a couple of formalities. I've been a Jeeper and an off-roader most of my life. I've also been a mechanic by trade most of my life. For me, a huge part of my passion for Jeeping is the build in the shop. It's something I really enjoy. This first series of videos is going to be on this 76 Cherokee Chief right here. This Cherokee Chief was a pretty long build. It took probably a couple of years total to finish. And like all my big builds, I'll do them in small steps. That way I don't get overwhelmed, which happens so often on people doing big full builds on vehicles. It also keeps me focused. It also gives me an idea if I'm doing part A and then part B and then part C. I kind of keep my eye out for what parts I'm going to need, look for deals. I always try to save huge money where I can. For instance, I find used axles and I know how to build axles. So I'll save a ton of money there. That allows me, when I decide I need an Atlas transfer case and there's no one around with a used Atlas transfer case, I can get one of those without blowing the whole budget on the build. So let's get started. Thanks for watching this channel. Please like it and subscribe to it, and hopefully I can inspire you to keep busy on your build. When we finished up the Chief, we ended up on 38-inch tall tires, a 17-inch 8-lug wheel. The rear axle's a General Motors 14-bolt full float, 456 gears, and a Yukon locker. The front axle's a GM Dana 60 with 456 gears and a Yukon air locker. It's also got hardened axles, and it's got some 1-ton hydro assist steering. The rear suspension is a 4-link coil. The front suspension is a radius arm coil. Then we have the drive lines, which are both 1350 CV joints, along with a 188 wall tube. It's also equipped with 4-wheel disc brakes. Now on to the power plant. It's got a 6-liter LS style engine, about 450 horse, followed by a 4L80E transmission. The interior's Mastercraft Baja buckets covered in orange leather. It's also got a nice new carpet kit in it. We started this project with a 37-inch tall tire and about a foot of clearance, sitting on leaf springs way too high. The rear axle is a GM 3/4 ton semi-float. The front axle is a GM 10-bolt 3/4 ton axle. Now moving to the engine, this is an AMC 360 4-barrel with a Dana 20 transfer case and a T18 4-speed. The passenger compartment wasn't too bad a shape once I tore out and threw away the seats. Just cleaned it up on the inside, pulled the carpet, painted where there was bare metal, and let it go. The rear part of this, on the other hand, had a nasty carpet with gear oil spilled in it, dog hair an inch thick, food, etc. I rolled it all up, chucked it in a dumpster, and cleaned it out real good. Turns out this has really solid metal in the floors. It was definitely a vehicle worth keeping. All right, so here we are underneath a factory configuration of a full-size Jeep fuel tank. You can see where the tank is to the left of the drive shaft, in between the frame rails, which is pretty close tolerances. So when whoever changed that rear end on the Chief put in a full-size centered rear end, the drive shaft was hitting the gas tank. That's why they put a big lift on it, to get this drive shaft below the tank so it wouldn't hit. So we're going to kill that tank and we're going to relocate it to the rear. Just a point of reference, if this were a quadra-track system, it would have offset differentials on both ends and an offset transfer case. This particular Jeep is a Dana 20, so it did have a somewhat centered differential, a Dana 44 and a Dana 20 transfer case. So, all that being said, once we get rid of that gas tank, I'm going to go do some research and find a factory tank that won't take a lot of modification to install. That way I can find replacement parts for that tank if I need it. It didn't take long to find a tank I liked on the internet, the early 80s full-size Bronco 33-gallon fuel tank. Will fit between the frame rails. It'll give me a lot more distance than the standard S10 that a lot of people convert into these. Junkyards had a 1980 Ford full-size Bronco fuel tank for 50 bucks with the skid plate, and they pulled it. I didn't even have to crawl around on the ground. Win. So here's the tank I got. It's currently set up for carburetor, which is no problem. I'll convert it to injection later. All I really had to do to this one is clean it up, paint it, and it's pretty much ready to install. Quick reminder, since we're going to start grinding and cutting, protection, ears, eyes, hands. All right, the design I came up with to mount this tank, a couple of pieces of 2x2 inch angle iron. Just using this one as an example. So the rear of the tank will be mounted with the angle iron at this orientation, and the front of the tank will be at this orientation. So what will happen, get this welded between the frame. The tank has a seam with a lip on it that's just going to come up and grab the bottom of this angle iron. The skid plate, which is also the tank strap for this fuel tank, has holes. I'll have to drill holes in the top of this at the same orientation in order to bolt it up. And yay, I get to use the same fill spout. All right, here we go. Drilling and cutting the angle iron, which will go between the frame rails, and get it all ready to mount. And there you can see the angle iron welded to the frame. Drilled some holes, ran some bolts down to the skid plate. And right up here is the lip of the gas tank. And you can see how that wraps around that angle iron. Same thing I did in the rear. Just added structure, piece of angle iron, and then it sets into the lip in the back. So once the tank was in, I plumbed the fuel filler hose. I also put a couple of light straps on it in order to keep it at a downhill angle to the gas tank. As another safety note, that is not radiator hose, that is fuel filler hose. Using radiator hose will probably leak in a short period of time, making a big gas leak, probably also plugging up stuff inside the tank as it disintegrates. And once it starts leaking or plugging things up, you're going to have a bad day. So definitely use fuel rated filler hose on the plumbing on this side. Just a side note on these gas tanks, kind of got lucky. The ohm rating for the Jeep sending unit to the Ford Bronco sending unit is almost the same, so I won't have to change anything as far as the calibration ohms for the fuel sending unit. My gauge should still work. Once the tank was all installed, I plumbed it, filled it up with fuel, drove it around, looked a little goofy with no bumper. After I was comfortable with how the conversion came out, I drained it and pulled it out. You can see there's a big hole cut in it, so I'm going to go with an in-tank fuel injection system. Before I start cutting up on tanks, I'm going to do a little sidebar here and talk a little bit about cutting and or welding on fuel tanks. This is a gas tank, and I'm going to be drilling a hole in this gas tank in order to adapt it to fuel injection. I've also welded on gas tanks, which is not recommended either. Gas tanks are pretty high risk to work on once they've been used because you have fumes in there. I have found that even if you rinse them out, clean them out, blow them out, fill them with water, there's still enough fumes in these tanks to cause a flash fire. I am not recommending anyone doing this. I'm just telling you this is what I do when I'm working on a gas tank. I still fill it, I still clean it, I still let it sit for several days before I am cutting and drilling and possibly even welding on it. So what I do, I take an exhaust hose. These exhaust hoses are used for working in a shop in the winter mostly. I can put it into the Jeep, start it up, run the other end out the door, work on the engine without asphyxiating myself. In this case, I'm going to hook one end to the tailpipe of the Jeep, start it up. The other end is going to go inside the gas tank. I'm just going to let it run. I'll keep the door open so I don't asphyxiate myself. What that's doing is displacing the oxygen in the tank. It's removing it. You need three things to create a fire. You need a fuel source, you need oxygen, and you need ignition. I'm assuming there's still a fuel source in the gas tank. I'm going to remove the oxygen out of that fuel tank with carbon monoxide because I also know when I drill into it, I'm creating an ignition source. Like I said, I'm not recommending this to anyone, but this is how I work on gas tanks that have been in service before. Okay, you can see the exhaust hose has been removed, the tank's cleaned out and ready to accept the new fuel system. I've decided to go with the Phantom in-tank universal fuel system. It's got a good collection boot at the bottom and a sponge collection for the fuel. I'm only going to have to use the Phantom 200 series. I'm not going to be running anything over 600 horsepower, and it's pressure rated for the LS. Everything came complete in the kit with one exception. I had to order a longer arm for the pickup and the fuel pump because the 33-gallon tank is exceptionally deep, and the one that came with it wouldn't quite reach. After everything was installed, I did discover that the float for the sending unit in the gas tank was interfering at the boot in the bottom of the pickup. So I reclocked the arm, and it's probably not as accurate as it was, but it'll still tell me empty and full. Here it is all assembled and ready to go in. -6 lines, nylon braided hose, and all harnesses are in. Now it's reinstalled. We're going to get ready to do the integrated skid plate, bumper, and I'll be doing the rear suspension at the same time since one will get rid of the other. So here I am getting the materials cut and drilled for not only the skid plate but for part of the bumper as well. The skid plate is 1/4 inch plate, which is welded to 3/16 angle iron, and then there's vertical posts that come up and tie into the frame. The back side kicks up on that angle iron, and I drilled holes in it which will tie into the rear bumper. So on the rear bumper I started off with some 2" by 4" rectangular tube. You can see here I drilled it, cut it, and shaped it to the approximate length I'll need it. So I'll get them all marked, start cutting, drill the first hole where I want it, and then go from there. Then I can, after the first one, duplicating it's easy. I also find pilot hole actually makes it a lot faster. Saves a lot on your bits too. Here you can see I've got all the holes drilled in that tube, and then I cut it and I welded nuts to the inside of it for the bumper to tie to. Then I set the bumper and bolted it with the corresponding holes, which lined up just fine. Now I welded some steps to the bumper so I can get into the back of this thing since I'm a little shorter than it is. I also put a receiver edge in. And on those top plates where the steps are, I came up with a pretty cool idea. Make some plates and spot weld some permanent grip tape, I guess you could say, to it. That way I don't have to worry about grip tape peeling off and having to replace it. And here's how the plates came out for the top of those steps. The spot welds seem to work out real good. I like how it looks. And then all I'm doing now is just cleaning up the rest of the bumper, making sure it'll look good after I paint it. I flipped it over and welded these struts to the back, and that tab up there will tie into where the old leaf springs used to mount. The only additional thing I did to the bumper was I welded this square tube on the top of it, which is nothing more than fill to cover the gap between the bumper and the tailgate. All right, we came out pretty good on this bumper assembly. It all came out good. It's clean, it's straight. If you notice, the lower section of these rear quarters are missing. They had some rot in them, so while I had all this apart, I just cut them off and flat plate a piece of 1/8 underneath it. And that ought to solve that problem. So here you can see how those struts tied into the frame and where that angle iron sits compared to the tank. You can also see at the top of this picture the tab that's welded to where the old leaf spring mount was in that strut. The back of this, you can see, creates a big triangle. It's bolted into the bumper. It weighs a lot, but it'll give it a lot of protection. Here's a side view of the skid plate, and like I said, we're doing the rear end swap, suspension, skid plate, bumper kind of all at once. So in order to get started on the differential conversion, I needed a donor truck. I picked up this 79 GMC 1-ton with a Dana 60 front and a 14 bolt in the rear, and then pulled the axles, parted the rest of the truck out, ended up making a couple $100 on the deal, and have a free set of axles. On the next video, I'll finish cleaning up the housing, grinding down the axle, making the tube look nice, getting the truss and all the mounts on the axle done, the brake rotors done, and then we'll do some gear setup on this unit. I did decide to go with a Grizzly locker, so we'll be talking quite a bit about locker and gear installation on the next video. All right, thanks for joining me on this first video. I came out fairly unscathed. I only gave myself a fat lip this time in the shop. A lot of preliminary work getting ready to do the differential swap and suspension conversion. If you like what you see so far, like and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.